Hello, beautiful people, and welcome to an in-depth melt and vaporize mechanics guide. In this guide, we're going to talk about the hidden properties of melt and vaporize and how to best utilize them to make your comps stronger. Let's start by taking a look at what happens when you use Chongyun's Burst without any reactions. As you can see, we get 384 damage on all three of the blades. Now, let's take a look at what happens when we use Bennett's Charge E before using Chongyun's Burst. We get 576 on the first two blades and 384 on the third blade. Finally, let's use Bennett's Tap E before we use Chongyun's Burst. In this case, we get 576 damage on all three of the blades. Now you might be wondering, what the fuck? And honestly, you'd be kinda right. This is not as intuitive as one would expect. You might also be wondering, well, how can I use this? I don't fucking play Chongyun. What do you think I am? Free to play? Well, my friend, you can use it on Chongyun, but you can also use it on a bunch of other Cryo or Pyro units. You can use it on Klee, you can use it on Diluc, you can use it on Xiangling, you can even use it on Kaeya. The idea behind this concept is actually pretty simple. Not all skills are created equal. You may not have noticed this, but some skills apply elements for a longer duration than others. These skills are considered strong skills. Skills that apply their element for a shorter period of time are considered weak. For the purposes of this explanation, we're only going to talk about Hydro, Cryo, and Pyro weak and strong skills. The only Hydro character that has an easy way to proc a strong skill is Childe with either his Burst or his Stance Change. For Cryo characters, we have Chi-Chi's Burst, Chongyun's initial cast of his skill, and Kaeya's skill. For Pyro characters, we have Klee's initial hit of her skill, Amber's Charge Shot, Amber's Baron Bunny, Bennett's tap of his skill but not his hold, and finally Bennett's Burst. Now, I told you which skills are strong and you can pretty easily figure out which are weak, but what does that tell us? What does a strong skill or a weak skill do, apart from lasting longer? Well, here's the thing. In case you didn't know, Melt and Vaporize both have two different ways of proccing them. You can proc Melt with Pyro or Cryo, or you can proc Vaporize with Hydro or Pyro. For Vaporize, if you apply the Pyro skill first, your Hydro skill will be multiplied by 2, and if you apply the Hydro skill first, your Pyro skill will be multiplied by 1.5. And for Melt, if you apply Cryo first, your Pyro skill will be multiplied by 2, and if you apply Pyro first, your Cryo skill will be multiplied by 1.5. Your first instinct would be to assume that you ideally don't want to be proccing Vaporize with Pyro or Melt with Cryo. But in reality, there's actually a really good reason to do that. If you apply Melt with Cryo, therefore dealing 1.5 times damage, it might not actually remove the Pyro status from the enemy, letting you proc Melt more than one time. This is the mechanic I showcased in the Chongyun reactions earlier. And this is where strong skills and weak skills come in. If you use a strong skill on a strong skill, you'll have about a 5-second window to use another skill and proc another Melt reaction. If you use a weak skill on a weak skill, you'll have about a 4-second window to proc another reaction. If you use a strong skill on a weak skill, it'll simply consume the status and you won't be able to proc another reaction. However, and this is the important part, if you use a weak skill on a strong skill, you'll actually be able to proc more than 2 reactions. Since Bennett's E-Hold is a weak skill, using Chongyun's Burst, which is also a weak skill, will let you melt twice. However, if you use Bennett's E-Tap, which is a strong skill, you'll actually be able to melt more than twice with Chongyun's Burst. Now you might be telling yourself, alright, that's useful on Chongyun, but how the fuck do I apply this to Diluc? Well, it's now time for the strongest 4-star unit in the game to come in. Xingqiu's Burst is a weak skill. However, most of the Pyro units that can benefit from having him in their team also have weak skills. This means that for Diluc, or for Klee, even if you weave your elemental skills in between your attacks, you'll actually be able to vaporize almost every single one of them. A lot of people see 1.5 for Vaporize, 2 times for Meld for Pyro, and they just completely discount Vaporize. In reality, if you use a cryo unit, you'll actually run into the problem of if you mess up your order once, it'll be very hard to remove the Pyro status effect from the enemies, which will in turn prevent you from proccing any melt reactions whatsoever with your Pyro abilities. As you can see in the clip I'm including here, if I mess up the order even once by using Bennett's skill right after his burst without weaving a cryo auto attack in between, I'll actually be completely unable to melt Bennett's E's, and I will only be able to melt his cryo normal attacks, which represent a very small portion of his damage. This is one of the main reasons why I don't personally recommend putting Chongyun in a party with Diluc. Not only will you have to watch your order really carefully, but because of the internal cooldown of the cryo application after you use Chongyun's skill, you actually won't be able to melt every single one of your E's. Xingqiu, on the other hand, does not have that problem. It doesn't even matter if you mess up your order. His internal cooldowns are so low that he's just gonna fix everything up for you. I gotta be honest with you guys. I advertise this video as an in-depth vaporize and melt mechanics, but in reality, there's only one unit who can really abuse this mechanic, so this is really just gonna be a Xingqiu guide. Now, before I get into how exactly you should be building your Xingqiu, just a quick disclaimer. My Xingqiu is not optimized. As you can see, my Xingqiu is level 70. And honestly, he doesn't need to be. As soon as you get him to 60 out of 70, you can stop right there. Leveling support units who don't trigger reactions past level 60 is usually a waste of resources. Ideally, you'll want to give your Xingqiu a sacrificial sword, but in case you don't have it, he can get by with just any energy recharge sword. Be it the Skyward Blade, the Favonius sword, or even just the 3-star Skyrider sword. In terms of artifacts, we need to make a distinction between the two playstyles that you can have with Xingqiu. I'll be calling the first playstyle reaction support and the second playstyle burst support. What I mean by reaction support is a support unit which you use only for their elemental reactions and not at all for their damage. What I mean by a burst support is simply a support unit into which you're going to invest resources for them to deal more damage. Xingqiu can fill either of those roles because the reactions that he provides are insanely strong and his damage is also insanely strong. If you choose to run Xingqiu as a reaction support, you'll want to maximize energy recharge and nothing else. This means you'll want to run a 2-piece Exile, 2-piece Scholar with energy recharge on your timepiece, maximizing energy recharge on your substats, and literally anything else for the rest. If you're using him as a burst support, however, you'll ideally want to be running him on 4-piece Noblesse Oblige, or if you already have a 4-piece Noblesse Oblige on your team, you can either give him 2-piece Noblesse Oblige and 2-piece Gladiators Finale, or you can give him 2-piece Noblesse Oblige and 2-piece of the upcoming Hydro set. If we look at the main stats we need, for the timepiece, I recommend either energy recharge if you don't have a lot in your substats, or attack percent. For the goblet, you definitely want hydro damage bonus, and for the circlet, you should try to go for crit rate or crit damage, but if you're unlucky like me and you don't have a good one, you can just grab an attack percent and it'll do the job just fine. In terms of substats, you'll want to prioritize energy recharge, then crit damage and crit rate, then attack percent, and then finally just flat attack. You don't need Elemental Mastery since Xingqiu will very rarely be the unit to trigger your reaction. Let's talk about his talents for a second. His normal attacks are honestly very weak, and are the main reason why you shouldn't be using him as a main DPS. The other main reason why you shouldn't be using him as a main DPS is because his skill has such a long cooldown that when you use him as a support, it's not too big of a deal. You can just avoid switching into him for 20 seconds. But when you're using him as a DPS, you'll notice the difference between him and any other DPS. His skill, while having a really long cooldown, does have some things to make up for it. First of all, it has a quite high ratio, and on top of that, it also hits multiple times, which means that A, you're going to get more energy particles, and B, your sacrificial sword has more than one chance to trigger, making the real chance of the effect happening much higher than indicated. Xingqiu's burst is the real reason he's an insanely strong support unit. Basically, he's just gonna make it rain with every single one of your attacks. His Ascension 1 passive is a pretty insignificant heal, and his Ascension 4 passive is 20% hydro damage bonus. Xingqiu's first constellation doesn't actually do that much for him. It's going to increase the tankiness that his E gives you, and is going to increase the healing just a tiny bit, but it's really not that significant. It starts getting interesting when we get to his second constellation. It's going to extend the duration of his burst by 3 seconds, and decrease the hydro resistance of enemies hit by his burst by 15% for 4 seconds. That's actually really, really strong. His constellations 3, 4, and 5 all increase the damage that his burst and his skill do by a pretty significant amount, but it's not game-changing. His constellation 6, on the other hand, is completely insane. His burst usually follows a pattern of 2 swords, and then 3 swords, and then 2 swords, and 3 swords, and so on and so forth. His 6th constellation is going to change that to a pattern of 2 swords, then 3 swords, and then 5 swords, and over again. Overall, just increasing the damage that his burst deals by an insanely significant amount. On top of that, it also gives him a bunch of energy regeneration, that unit that's only good with constellations. God damn it. His purpose isn't to be the flashy, one huge number kind of carry. He's simply going to be the support that's there through it all, through thick and thin, and who's going to push your team to the next level. All this to say, if you haven't built your Xingqiu yet, you should. Alright, now let's talk about the comps that he either enables or contributes heavily to. Obviously, Xingqiu is an amazing support for Klee and Diluc because of the mechanic mentioned earlier in the video. However, he also has uses as a reaction support outside of those comps. The first notable example of this is going to be when using Bennett as your main DPS. When combined with Chongyun, he's going to make it so that enemies are constantly frozen, which is going to make it way easier for Bennett to proc his melt. Now you might be thinking that freezing enemies doesn't increase your DPS, but in reality, frozen enemies cannot generate shields. This means that in Abyss 12 Chamber 3, you'll actually get a huge decrease in the time necessary to kill the Fatui because they won't have time to generate their shields back. If you want to play Chongyun as your DPS, you can include Xingqiu in your comp so that your Chongyun can proc Shatter about every second or third attack. Another notable comp that Xingqiu is going to enable is Keia DPS. By pairing Xingqiu's birth with Chongyun's skill, Keia is going to be able to permanently freeze the enemies, maintaining the uptime on his Cryo artifact set that is coming in patch 1.2, basically 100%. This is actually the comp that I've been playing on stream for a little bit over a week now, so if you'd like to see it in action, feel free to come check me out at twitch.tv/Zajeff77. You definitely shouldn't be running a Cryo DPS unit on floor 12, but on both floor 10 and floor 11, this comp is amazing. On floor 10, there are a lot of enemies that have a Pyro status effect, making reverse melt very strong, and on floor 11, you benefit from the 75% cryo damage bonus. On top of that, since you're keeping enemies basically permanently frozen, it's really easy to play. And it makes your Abyss clears and just your overworld exploration much more comfortable. Xingqiu's burst can also be really useful when you're using Keqing, Razor, or Beidou as your main DPS. You won't get as much out of it as you would in a Bennett, a Klee, a Diluc, or a Keia comp, but you'll still get a lot of damage from his burst. Both from the burst damage itself, and from the electrocharge reaction that your carry will be proccing. Since people usually level their carries to the maximum, you'll actually get a pretty big DPS increase out of proccing electrocharge on every attack. If you're using Child as a main DPS, I would not recommend Jingcho unless he has his Constellation 2, which reduces the enemy's Hydro resistance. If you do have that constellation, he becomes an excellent support for Child. If you're running Ningguang or Noelle as your main DPS, Jingcho isn't an amazing option, but since they're both Geos, they don't have too many amazing options, so Jingcho is still one of the best. I will say, however, that the Jingcho plus Beidou combination to support Ningguang feels amazing to play. Another one of the comp options you might not actually be thinking of includes Xiangling, which is an insanely strong pairing, especially when coupled with other units like Bennett and Sucrose, and it can really get out of hand with how strong the Reverse Vaporize is in this comp. If instead of using Jingcho you were to use Kaeya, here's what happens. After only a few reactions, the enemy is affected by the Pyro status effect, and it becomes more or less impossible to melt with Xiangling, and all of the melts are occurring on Kaeya now, which is going to considerably reduce the overall damage you're dealing if you have a stacked carry and not a stacked support. Even if you were to use 2 cryo supports, you'd still run into the same issue because Xiangling's pyro application is going to be faster than both of your cryo supports combined. This is why the 1.5 reactions are usually going to be more overall damage than the 2 times reactions, unless you're just going for one big hit. And since for most of us, Genshin Impact is a game about DPS and not one big hit of damage, the 1.5 times reactions are oftentimes better than the 2 times reactions. That about does it for this guide. I hope you learned something. If you are curious about more specifics on the Chongyun mechanics, I'll leave a link down in the description below to a really useful video on that topic. If you enjoyed the video, drop a like, subscribe, leave a comment down below telling me how your day was, and check me out on Twitch. Farewell, beautiful people.